Before you start this episode, I just wanted to let you know that there's a trigger warning associated with this episode. We discuss topics which may be sensitive to some listeners, such as pregnancy, birth, infertility, in the context of the story of Star Wars. Welcome, everyone, to What the Force. I'm Marie-Claire Gould, your host, and I have a special guest to cover Power of Myth and Symbolism with me today. Hello, Missy.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good. And you are a lifelong Star Wars fan who's a designer in IRL, real life,
Yes.
with a background in animation, but you also have like this massive love of mythic stuff. And we end up like having these really cool conversations. You recommend books, we talk about things, and then you have these like epic tweet threads occasionally where you're like, here you go, world. This is how I feel about the universe. And yeah, you are quite critical of Star Wars, which, I mean, to be fair, it deserves it right now.
This is very true.
It's been a little while since I've done, a mythic symbolism episode. I just wasn't like in the mood. And there's a few reasons for that. But I do think it's important to talk about this subject in particular, which is the missing divine feminine of the galaxy far, far away. And that's what we're going to talk about today, which is really exciting.
I'm so excited.
I really do love this quote from Faust, which is, "The eternal feminine draws us on." It feels like people constantly try to squash it down, consciously or unconsciously. We have an entire episodes of The Mandalorian where there's literally no women or femme facing characters, right? And
yes,
it is like, okay, so these are the new stories that are being created. And again, I know that it takes a long time to produce Star Wars stories, but it also feels a little hard when we go into this, or when we get stories that are new, that they're treated maybe not quite with the sensitivity that they should be.
Right. Yeah. I believe that there's a reason many people feel left out of the current mythology in Star Wars, and that they don't feel reflected in it. And or many people find that they will see themselves reflected in characters that they didn't expect. And that's where I think there's, a likelihood that that suppression of the divine feminine that you're talking about, it is still trying to break through. It is still bubbling up. It's just fascinating. I think some of these characters that we're drawn to that we might not expect.
Yeah, I think that this is one of the biggest mistakes or misrepresentations about randos on the internet that people made, especially about Kylo/Ben Solo. So women not only identified with Rey, but they also identified with Ben, because Ben was the shadow form of Rey. There was a shadow reflection in Ben Solo. And to be a complete human, you need both sides. And that's the symbology and the larger sort of psychology behind Reylo, was that together you're a full and complete, human that has transcended and has incorporated all of the different mythical aspects and psychological aspects of themselves, their darkness, which was reflected in Ben, but also he had a lot of emotionality that many, people identified with. And it wasn't necessarily just women or, femme people. It was also men who saw that sensitivity aspect in him and the struggles and the mistakes and, or mask people. It just, people seem to just like pass that by and be like, oh, you just thought he was hot. And it really was not about that. There was some about that, but it wasn't wholly about that.
Yeah, it really wasn't, because it's so interesting. When I listen to people talk about Ben Solo as a character, it's, it's a running joke, right? That like, oh, well, he's such a soft boy.
Yeah.
But isn't that interesting? Is that what many fans are attracted to is that softness and that emotionality that you mentioned, and the way that the viewer is drawn to feel protective of him. And so we relate to how Rey feels protective of him, and the way that we would like to see Leia appear at more moments, and things like that. And you see a lot of people feel this way. And you do see, a lot of queer fans who really are very drawn to him, and a lot of, I've heard a lot of fathers describe being very drawn to Ben Solo. And again, I think it's that, we see that hurt child inside, that injured child. And that brings out an aspect that we might term maternal, regardless of whether the person experiencing it is a mother.
Yeah, it's certainly on the nurturing and protective side of our personalities. And
absolutely,
archetypically, in a traditional or in a historical sense, that would be considered to be mothering.
Right.
Right.
And it's so interesting because so one of the things I was studying a little bit is the concept of an ethic of care as a form of heroism, because frequently, heroism is these great deeds, frequently combat is involved in mythological heroism, there's many things. And this idea that simple care, just, serving the needs of another person in the small ways, in someone who is sick, someone who is, too young or too old to care for themselves. And this idea that this is a form of heroism. And what I was reading was talking about how historically that's associated with women. Of course, the prototypical women's work, right? But it's obviously not something that only women or femme people do. This is something that everyone does and that everyone needs. And so it's an absolutely vital part of our psyche. So, if we characterize that as the inner feminine of all people, and or just the inner, need to nurture and to be nurtured. Yeah. It really shows how important that is to all these myths.
Exactly. That was such a good way to put that. I do think it's really fascinating when we do kind of step back and look at Star Wars. What ends up happening is anytime there's a obvious motherly character in Star Wars, there is a tragic end to that character, right? There are a few exceptions, right? But it does start to be like, okay, being a mother is tragedy in Star Wars.
Yes.
And I struggle with that a fair amount, because to me, it's just reflecting something that Joseph Campbell himself started to discover in his later work and didn't get a chance to really publish his own thoughts on it. But he did tons of lectures near the end of his life on the missing feminine, the goddess figure in our mythology. And, Campbell, good or bad for those people, it is a good lens to view Star Wars through, because Star Wars tends to rely on it more than anything else. And he understood the goddess as an important figure who was not just a singular aspect, but you could only, if you were unenlightened, only view one particular aspect at a time. If you saw the full power of the goddess, you were often overwhelmed and potentially destroyed. That was always his thing in his early work, right? But what's important is that it feels like there is a divine feminine missing from Star Wars. And that plays out in the archetypes that we see come out into the story. One of Campbell's favorite themes was the transformation and endurance of the archetypical symbolic power of the divine feminine, because it had almost disappeared for 2,000 years under the patriarchal and monolithic religious traditions that have attempted to exclude them. This is from the Goddess's book, which I highly recommend. I did an episode on it like forever ago before Tross. And, I also did an episode on, female power fantasies and the heroine's journey. And all of these things are kind of interconnected, because it's not just, and I've said this so many times, it's not just about women or femme people. It is about that aspect, that nurturing, that creation, that inner goddess archetype. I mean, historically speaking, inside of all of us. And no matter what you are, you have these aspects. To your point, the nurturing and the caregiving is something that all humans need to be part of human social systems, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And it's wonderful when we see that reflected, regardless of gender. Inside of social systems, we see that, hey, I'm an adult and I care for my older parents, or I care for my children, or I care for another person that is next to me, like a sibling. That care is what is missing, right? Fundamentally, because why is this all important? Creation, love, care is why we fight wars.
Yes. Yes. And that's so huge, because
why do we fight wars? Why do we care? Why do we care about the idea of the empire ruling versus the New Republic?
Right. Right. And this is, and what's fascinating about that is the focus on the wars and, we're fighting for good, or we're fighting to protect, the right, or protect, to save what we love, like, to quote Rose, we love Rose. But when we talk about this, what are we fighting to protect?
There's always like a ... like, what is it again?
But what I'm so sad about with Star Wars more recently is I feel concerned that there has been a lot less of that. There has been less of showing what exactly it is we are fighting for, or in such a way where you can't even imagine sometimes what will this galaxy look like when the war is over? Can we even picture it? Can we even conceive of it? And with some of the recent work, and especially Tross, I really do struggle to envision the galaxy after the war. And I mean, we can get into how the war is not technically over and all of that kind of stuff. But the point is that if the war were to end, I don't see it right now, because no one has ever tried to end the war by caring for one another. And that's the thing. There is no idea of that caring is peacemaking.
Yeah. It all comes down to Padme.
Yes.
And it comes down to Shmi. And it comes down to the mothers of the galaxy, like Leia, who are willing to be like, I don't care if my son has done terrible things. I want him back because I love him. Right. So and there are other archetypical ways to talk about a femme experience, and certainly, explore those, use those as your own way. But this is about, a thing that all humans do, which is nurturing, love, and care. And it is something that seems to have been forgotten from Star Wars as like the reason we fight.
Yes.
It's
how we end the conflict, and
how do we end the conflict?
Yep.
Is by loving one another. It's not about killing one another. It's never been about that, because destruction creates more destruction. Right. And this is all like metaphorical and symbolic. But the thing is about space fantasy is that you can get away with it because of the Force. Right. And we're going to get into some of the kind of in-universe mythology, as well as out-of-universe mythology and mythical stories, because I think it's important to kind of talk about these things together. One of my favorite moments, and one of your favorite moments, and you brought this up, is when Luke and Leia have a conversation about their mother.
Oh my gosh. It's possible I might cry. This is one of my favorite scenes in the entire saga, has been since I was a child. Mentioned it. I'm a lifelong Star Wars fan. My parents, their recessional music at their wedding in 1978 was the theme from Star Wars. So that's how far back my love of Star Wars goes, to my parents getting married. And so I grew up watching these films and just loving them so much. And the scene where Luke and Leia talk about their mother, who at that time was not Padme.
No, unknown mother that Leia sort of remembered. And I thought that assumed, like when I saw it back like in the 80s, because like that was my first Star Wars, really.
Yep.
I assumed that she had like lived with her mother for a few years.
I did too. That was my assumption. And I believe that, in some versions of the story, it was she left. She actually married Bail Organa in some versions of the story. And so anyway, I know. It's a whole thing. But like the point is that like they start talking about their mother. And firstly, it's Luke that brings it up. He asks about it. And prior to this, we've heard no indication that Luke thinks of his mother. He's only ever talked about his father. That in the whole story, and all of a sudden, he wants to know about his mother. And he asks his sister, and she shares her memories. And right at the turning point of this entire journey that he's on, he's seeking to reconnect with his mother.
Yes.
And it's so beautiful. And it shows how, despite her absence, she is so important. And the idea that she exists and that she loved him at one point just gives him the strength to do what he needs to do to save his father. And I love it. It's gorgeous. And
it opens the door to the things that we were talking about, which is care and love and bridging gaps, which enable him to do that to his father. Because I think that he realizes that his mother was a loving person, and it's not like this was a mistake. The two, Leia and Luke existing was a mistake. It was brought about by love, which means that love could be given back through him to Vader, to Anakin.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting because like I've spoken with Charles Soule and but in the comics, in the Vader comics, when he's at his castle, he sees Luke after Padme sort of dies in this weird mystical vision that he has, but he sees this light at the end off in the distance that is this blue light that is, often associated with the Force and the light side of the Force. And that is the promise. And it's literally handed because Leia gives the love, the remembrance of love. And that is what is the power that saves Anakin.
Yes.
The remembrance of love.
Yes. And in the book, because I love the I mean, I think they've rewritten it a couple times, but the one I'm thinking of, I think the first Return of the Jedi novelization, when Luke takes Anakin's helmet off, Vader's helmet off, and sees Anakin as he's dying, he is struck by memories of his wife.
Oh.
And then he feels his son's tears on his lips, and he tastes the salt. And it's just so gorgeous. And this idea that, again, that, the memory of the mother keeps returning in those moments where the family is being reconciled. And that's amazing. And I love it. So,
yeah. This is like the worst time in the world to bring up the Da Vinci Code, but I'm going to bring it up. We talked about this before we recorded, and you're like, "Oh my god!" What the meme that you said, just as a setup, the worst person.
Which one?
The worst person.
The worst person just made an excellent point or something like that.
Yeah, that's how I feel
about Dan Brown.
Yeah, Dan Brown. Yeah, well, like the whole meta of the Da Vinci Code is that there is the missing mother of the church, i.e. Mary, in the mythology. And this is something that like Campbell and Maria Gambudis, as an archaeologist who was trying to find the missing goddess from the last, longer than 2,000 years, that she has been missing from especially Western culture in our mythic stories. And this is just a reflection exactly what Campbell has talked about, especially in creative mythology, that the goddess is missing from our mythology, but she can never be fully destroyed because she is part of us. And so psychologically, she's going to like pop up and become more powerful and then try to be squished down by the patriarchy. And literally, that is what happened to the sequel trilogy. Absolutely. It is crazy. So the thing about The Last Jedi that many people kind of misunderstand, not women, I think, who resonated with it, or femme people, or people who say finally got it out of the story. They're like, oh my God, this story has a lot to it. But it spoke on a variety of levels towards a femme psyche. And like the biggest compliment I got from my mom after I showed it to her, because she like saw the original ones, but has never really been into Star Wars. I'm like, you have to watch TFA and TLJ before Tross.
Right.
I
know.
Right.
We're all such clowns. What do you do?
But like me and her, like we both, when I saw TLJ for the first time, I ended up having like the most vivid dreams because it was like hitting my psyche in a weird way. And she called me the next day and she's like, Marie Claire, like this movie, I had the craziest dreams after. Yeah, because it's hitting on like symbolism, and it's speaking to a particular form of psyche that, I mean, certainly affected us, right? And when you're able to kind of come around to that, you're like, oh, wow, this is very powerful because it is speaking to a part of you that has not been spoken to in a long time, especially within the Star Wars universe and the Star Wars mythology. And because it brought it to very formative symbols, earth, water, air, creation, the beginning, it just resonated very strongly with these feelings that are archetypically assigned to the goddess. It's crazy. Unfortunately, when Tross happened, it didn't take it to the next level. Love didn't heal Palpatine, which, could have been a thing. Ben's love of Rey did heal her, but then there was no synthesis where they were to combine together into a transcendent form because she had, it's like nothing happened in the end.
Yeah. Well, Rey's love was not framed as powerful enough.
Yes. Which is like,
yeah.
Oh.
And for that matter, Leia's love was not framed as powerful enough.
Yeah.
Neither of them. So yeah.
They didn't end up having this overwhelming power that is often talked about from a mythological perspective, because Love is the most powerful thing psychologically. And if you ignore that, it just kind of feels empty.
It's true. It's true. And as much as love by anyone is the most powerful thing, it is notable how the pattern in mythology is that the journeys of feminine characters to recover those they love are often successful.
Yeah.
Whereas,
and very hard. They're very hard. They're full of trials.
They are.
And they have to go to hell.
Yes. Yes. And the journeys of the masculine characters are often not met with as much success. And I've read a lot of theories about why that may be. There's a study. Now, granted, I think this is older because this is from a book that was written in published in 1992. So this is probably out of date. But at the time that this book was written, and if anyone's curious, it's In Search of the Swan Maiden, a narrative on folklore and gender by Barbara Foss Levy, and I highly recommend it. It's excellent. But in this book, she references a study that says that I think it was a Harvard study or it was some higher learning institution that interviewed many, many people along gender lines about what their fantasies were. What are your dreams, your fantasies, power fantasies as they may be, like daydreams, basically, what are the things that you imagine for yourself? And they found that frequently masculine identifying people saw little chance of recovery after a failure. They saw failure as permanent. And that many femme-identifying people found they expected recovery. They expected another chance and the likelihood of success. And that was so fascinating to me when I read that, because I thought that explains so much about the perspective that so many of these stories are written from. And so you see that in The Quest for the Lost Bride, where the bride is not recovered, and The Search for the Lost Husband, where the husband is.
Yes.
And so it really is fascinating. And this is another thing I really want to mention, because this is so important. In many searches for the lost husband, the bride is already pregnant or already a mother. Psyche is pregnant when she pursues Cupid.
Right.
Janet is pregnant when she pursues Tamlin.
Yeah.
There are lots of examples, but what is interesting is they are living on that cusp of maidenhood and motherhood.
Right.
And pursuing.
It's that transformational period of time similar to adolescence.
Right. And but it's so interesting because they are, in that moment, they are both the bride and the mother in pursuit of the lost masculine. So it's cool. It's cool.
Yeah, that is cool. It's so interesting that you brought up Psyche and Cupid, because it's one of those stories that I always thought that Raylo was leaning into because of the missing masculine and the missing feminine within themselves, right?
Yes.
And how those things kind of ended up tying together, right? So, and the transformative aspects of love, you mentioned Swan Princess, or Swan Maiden, which I also thought that Tross was going to lean into. And like, weirdly, I was right about so many things, but yet kind of wrong. Like, at what cost? Like, it was so weird. Like the fact that Palpatine wanted to capture Rey and like make her his, make her him. Like, I'm like, oh my God, this is not what I pictured. But hey, there you go. They are still plugging into parts of the psychology that they don't understand necessarily fully in a storytelling aspect, which is a seeking of divine feminine power.
Yeah.
How do I control it? How do I have it without necessarily, needing to put up with the noisy, femme identifying person that controls it? It's utter sucky. Unless it's done with forethought and understanding where these things come from.
Well, I think that you correctly assumed that they would plug into the the universal unconscious. I think that we underestimated the power of patriarchy.
Absolutely.
So yeah.
I mean, it's the institution. It's institutionalized, like many of our horrible things about our society, racism, sexism. These things are institutionalized because they're built into our laws. They're built into our social contracts. And it's fascinating, to see when somebody like Ryan, and he's spoken about this on, Joseph Gordon-Levitt's podcast, about how he speaks and tells stories from a place of his own, like, internal demons in some ways, or shadows. He talks about, he's like, I've got these things, I think about them, and then I turn them into stories. So he's more in touch with his own psyche. And then he also told the story with the ever watchful presence of Carrie Hart, who read every single updated draft or every single day what he had done and gave him comments. So there was always somebody in the room and to give him feedback on, hey, this feels right. This feels like the story that they were trying to tell. I absolutely think that was the original intention. And we get some really amazing, cool moments. Like, I'm still obsessed with healing the snake in trust. Like, I love that moment so much because it is a representation of what we're talking about. This love for the other, this love for the things that are dark around us. And it's just, these things are there. And that's where I think, like, they were probably pulling from an outline that George had, because it's so Campbellian for him, for the story to have healed a snake. It's like, it's incredibly Campbellian and George. And then, like, it's like the point, like, passed them by. Like, they didn't understand the symbols.
Right. Yeah. It's very, I think you've talked about it before, about how it's symbolically dissonant, and it is. It's very confusing to watch. And I don't know. Recently, I'm finding that more and more about Star Wars is that there are parts of Star Wars that, to me, ring so true, and the symbolism, to me at least, is so clear, and I feel that I can understand what it's telling me. And then there are other parts of it that are very vague to me, and what I assume when I see the ones that read the ones that don't make as much sense to me, that aren't as clear, is that they also weren't clear to the creators. I think that, there was a lack of clarity in what they were trying to say, or what we're seeing is what you were talking about earlier, which is, that tension between the patriarchal structures in our culture and that divine feminine trying to break through.
Yeah. Which is why I find it so fascinating that the Bad Batch came in, and I assumed Omega would be a little boy, and they made her a little girl.
Right.
I find that interesting. So interesting. And I do appreciate that. And I'm watching the Bad Batch, and I'm just sticking with it because I don't know exactly the story that they're trying to tell, and that's exciting to me. But it's really fascinating to watch them have these nurturing models within the Bad Batch, have these, explorations of self within Omega, but there isn't really a definition of difference in Omega's, outward facing, presence yet. Right. Like, it's interesting. I'm sticking with it just for the sake of, like, being like, okay, tell me a story and let me know how it is.
Yeah. And, I know, as much as I said earlier that it's possible to see ourselves reflected in many different characters, regardless of whether they are femme or masc presenting. And that is true. At the same time, I'm really getting to the point where, if you're not going to make an active effort to give me a character I can identify with, then I just don't know how much energy I have for this anymore, because I truthfully, I can only handle so many dads in Star Wars before I'm like, but I really do feel left out, guys. I really do feel left out.
Yeah.
I love it, and it's beautiful, and it's a great story, and it's a story worth telling. But there are so many stories worth telling, and I want to see all of them.
Well, and it's also really hard when we kind of think about the presented moms and these stories, and the types of moms that end up stacking up in particular ways, like the fridged mom, the dark mom, and then, POV mom, which we have very little of. We have very little POV mom. We have a little bit with Shmi. We have a little bit with Padme. Kind of at the end of their journeys, we get their own voice,
Yes.
But the biggest one we have, of course, from POV is Frog Mom.
Yep.
Doesn't even have a name.
Yes. And doesn't even speak, really.
Yeah. Speaks with the use of technology. But like fridge moms being moms who have ended up dead.
Right. Which unfortunately is almost a joke now in Star Wars.
Oh my God. I read a Mary Sue article from 2017. It's like, what's with all the dead moms? It's like, oh God.
Yeah. And they're not wrong. So
not wrong. Yeah.
Nope.
Like you go through the list and you're like, wow.
Yeah.
We don't have a lot of moms that live anywhere. Like,
No. Should we list some?
I mean, yeah, we could just, you go, I'll go.
Yeah. Oh, goodness. All right. Well, there's the obvious ones, of course, which are, Shmi and Padme.
Yeah.
There's just so many. But
we got to see Lyra Urso die on screen.
Which also many people point out makes no sense when you think about it. Like, why would she basically... Why would she leave her daughter and then immediately run and aim a weapon at the...
She would have gone and hidden with her daughter. Yeah. And then like nobody leaves their kid alone like that. That's just like that. There's a reason why it was like mothers and children off the ship first. Like,
right.
You had to have somebody with the kids. Like, it's just not something that you leave their kids alone in a hole. Okay.
No,
Star Wars.
And then to frankly suicidally point a weapon at the Imperials. Like, why? I don't understand. So things like that. So, and then obviously Briha Organa and Baru.
Yeah.
Shara Bay. Like, unfortunately, there's just so many, and it's heartbreaking.
Wedge's mom.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. It's just the list is long.
Yeah. Hera herself is somebody who we haven't seen the rest of her story, but she is considered to be, and this is where I struggle with Star Wars storytelling, because there's like this idea that you cannot be a mom and be a fighter at the same time, whereas you can be a dad and be a fighter.
Yeah. Yes. Which
you have to do one or the other. And I don't know about you, but I hold a job, have hobbies, and am a mother. Look at that. I can do it all.
Same. Yeah. But it's also just the concept of, again, of the idea of a hero being more than a warrior, I think.
Yeah.
In many ways, because, you've got, which is why you hear people talk about, General Organa and everything. And that's great. And I love General Organa as, another iteration of Leia. I love, speaking of which, Leia is my favorite character in Star Wars. I love her so very, very much.
Yeah.
And I'm fine with General Leia. I like a heck of a lot better than Jedi Leia.
But she got like a good play of being a concerned mom in the books, like
right,
as well as in TFA and TLJ.
Yeah, but it's interesting because it is very much always set Leia's actions are always set in tension with her being a mother, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like when she's General Organa, she's in direct opposition to her son. She's on the opposite side of a war from her son.
Yep.
You know, she's giving orders that can result in the injury or death of her son, you know. And then you've got when she's, you know, in the books, to your point, when she's
a senator,
senator, right? It is very much suggested that she is somewhat neglectful because she's putting all of her focus into her politics, or at least that is one interpretation some people do have of it. And you know, there's a lot going on there with this idea of, you know, whether women can have it all and all this other stuff. But it's just really interesting to me. And even Padme, when there's a scene in Revenge of the Sith where she talks about how she doesn't think the queen will continue to allow her to serve, and so she's going to leave. Yeah, and I mean, she does seem to want to give all her attention to her child, which is great. But it's just interesting that even the idea of her continuing to serve in the Senate while being a mother is not really considered feasible. So there's a lot of that where it's like, it's to the extent that we do have mothers in Star Wars, they're only allowed to be a mother.
Yeah. And then they die.
And then they die. And then they die. But yeah, no, to Hera, I think to your point about Hera, I'm very curious to see about what they do with Hera in the future, because I think there's an amazing opportunity to finally have the POV mother.
Yeah.
I would love that. I would love to know about Hera raising Jason in this world that she helped build. And that goes back to what we were talking about with, you know, what is this? The divine feminine is creation. It is the instinct to creation. And Hera has, through her work in the Alliance, helped to create
something new
world. Yes, exactly. And so her son is really a manifestation of that. And I would love to see that play out, because there's still so much story to tell there.
I do also want to point out that, like, Hera, you know, is often presented as space mom in, you know, the Ghost crew. Yes. And that is completely valid. I don't want to take away from that, because she certainly acts in that way. I do have a struggle with that, because they're also like part of a crew and have designations and order. And like, I'm, you know, Spectre 1, I'm Spectre 2. And so I do struggle with that interpretation a little bit, just because it's also slightly militaristic, and I struggle with that in general.
Yes. Yeah. It's
right?
uncomfortable when the only found family that we see in our stories is a military one, because to your point, it's a little wild. Yeah. It's
a rebel cell. It still has a militaristic tone to it, even though it's a found family of rebels. Awesome. It's still important. She is, you know, the one that gives the hugs, the one that cares and does nurture. I just want to have more of that story. You know, and this comes back to what we talked about at the start of the episode, which is that, you know, why do you fight? Right. And yeah, Yoda's asked a lot how Jedi choose to fight is important. But to me, what's missing is the why we fight. Right. And like, there's so much to unravel about Star Wars in association with this, that it's almost like as soon as you start to peel back these layers, the stories that maintain and hold structure when you look at the why are the ones that have answered that question.
Yep.
Okay, let's talk about Mortis, because it is the largest what I would consider to be absentee of mom, you know, mythological story. And, you know, we've talked a little bit about the mythology outside of the story of Star Wars. And then, you know, talking about the mythology within Star Wars. So Mortis is something that is continuously brought up. The Mortis gods themselves are sort of a mainstay and are brought back like multiple times to push along the mythological meta plot. You recently watched the Mortis arc.
Oh boy. Yes, I did. I'm really happy to have this conversation, because I trust you to explain to me what I'm missing. Marie Claire, because I've heard so much about the Mortis arc for so long, and I finally watched it. And yes, I know I'm extremely behind. It's Clone Wars is long, y'all.
Yeah.
It's really long.
Like you've been catching up on Clone Wars.
I have.
But you also watched Rebels, I think.
I've seen all of Rebels.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So you were familiar with the iconography of the.
Well, that's what's wild about it, right? Is that I saw it all from the Rebels perspective, which is it didn't have a lot of these details in it. So I think that's why it's interesting to now come into Clone Wars after seeing Rebels and go, this is
wait a second.
Yeah, wait, hang on. This isn't what I expected. So I guess what I want to throw out there is, aside from the obvious, which I do want to get into, which is the fact that there is no mother in this mystical family, which is odd. I also want, to point out that the issue of balance and imbalance was not resolved in the way that I was anticipating. I understand that at this point in Anakin's journey, we are meant to see things going more and more and more off kilter. So I do understand that. I was not necessarily expecting a happy resolution to this. But what I was not expecting was for all members of this mystical family to be dead at the end. Spoilers, but they're all dead. And that was so strange to me, because what is the purpose of this story? Is it really about balance? If we only find balance in destruction, and that's what it brings it back to, this creation versus destruction dichotomy, which is,
where is the creation?
Right. Is destruction the only balance that we have? Because that ties into Tross. Tross, supposedly finding balance at the end of Tross is through all of this destruction. And it doesn't really make sense. There's nothing new created, and we don't see the iconography of creation in the end. I don't know.
Yeah, which is, it's really fascinating because in other properties, the creation aspect has come out more. So I'm thinking specifically of Vader Immortal to do with that storyline and how Mustafar used to be a lush planet. It was destroyed and brought back to be this lava place. And then by the time Tross happens, it's actually starting to heal. And you can actually see like the trees and things like that. And it's like something they forgot in Tross. Like they kind of remembered, but then they forgot that also has to be part of the cycle of life, right? So Mortis itself is this, it operates on 3 levels that I've been able to determine. Again, every time I watch it, it drives me freaking crazy because then I'm like, oh my God, I can see all the possibilities. Okay, so fundamentally, it is the story of Anakin, Obi-Wan, and Ahsoka going on an adventure. Right? That's the in-universe. They go on an adventure. Suddenly, they're out of space and time. It is considered to be an elsewhere or a world between worlds type vergence in the Force, very similar to what Ezra experiences, but it is all through the lens of Anakin Skywalker's psyche. Padme is creation. He is destruction. The universe is like, this is terrible. This is, everything is out of balance. It is still the story of Leia, Luke, and Anakin as well. You can look at it from that lens. And it is the story of meta-reflected Anakin, Obi-Wan, and Ahsoka as the Force gods.
Yes.
You can look at it through all of these different lenses, but fundamentally, it is a broken system. What has been established is a patriarchal regime to control the natural symbiosis of the galaxy.
Yeah. And it was amazing how often they used the word control in those episodes. I was shocked to hear. And it was always, well, you need to control this. We need to be able to control them. I'm here to control my children. And I was just thinking, why is there so much control in this story? And it's the patriarchal power that is trying to, forcefully control, pun intended, but forcefully control these entities.
What's fascinating is that there is actually 2 aspects of the Force. There is the cosmic force and there is the living force.
Yep.
And the father represents the cosmic force, the will of the force, which is he doesn't want these aspects of the force, these two creation and destruction aspects, to destroy the universe. But if they were to be left alone without this like divine will telling them that they must be controlled, they would be fine because they actually cared about each other. The love would have healed them. It's one of the reasons why I absolutely love the one comic that was presented as the kind of like the end of the universe, where it was part of one of the Visions comics. It has the two aspects of the force, sort of like these force gods fighting throughout the galaxy. And in the end, the only way that they can resolve their issues is if they come together and know that they each have a role within the galaxy. The reason why Mortis is so frustrating is because it is a tragedy. It doesn't tell us the solution. Right. It just presents the question. And it doesn't, one of the things that like Dave Filoni's kind of does, and this is something he learned from George, so, I blame George, is that they don't like to tell you the solution to the problem, right? They want to just present it. But there's some people don't have the comprehension to understand like these very symbolic and psychological things. They're saying that this traditional sense of a male figure in the top and, two children battling it out is not a good system to last. And from a family systems perspective, which I've talked about, like with the Rev, that
was such a good episode.
Inevitably will inevitably destroy itself because, you're going to have a stronger relationship with one or the other at any given time. And you need to figure out this, although triangles are naturally very strong.
They're stable.
Systems. Yes.
I do want to point out another aspect to this, which is so interesting, which is that many mother goddesses throughout history and mythology hold both the power of creation and destruction within them at the same time.
Yes.
So, Kali, Hathor, like a lot of these goddesses, they are both.
They have a dark aspect and
Right. And even because what they do is they represent the cycle. Right. They don't represent only one part of it because that is the imbalance when you have only the creation or only the destruction. They both have to be there because that is the cycle that allows life to continue. And so what's fascinating is that, to your point, if the son and the daughter, the destruction and creation, are not in balance, then in order for them to be in balance, what you actually need is the power of the goddess.
Yeah.
And so that's what's so remarkable about the fact that the mother is missing from this story, is that the mother really is the solution. She is the synergy of the two.
She has always been the solution for Anakin too. It's what he's always been missing. And like the problem is that he is one of those pivot people within the Force. He is a Virgins in the Force himself. And so that's why Mortis, it reflects his own psyche in so many ways. And why there is no mother is because he has been taken away from his mother his whole life, or since he was 9 years old. And he's constantly looking for feminine archetypes to give him that missing self. So he, Shmi missing, Padme and Ahsoka. He's constantly projecting this femininity out there and capturing those people within his view. And then he is utterly destroyed when they leave him. Not through their own fault, of course.
Right.
It's just what happens because he hasn't found that within himself.
Right. Well, and another thing I'd love to kind of bring back in here is, earlier we were talking about the Swan Maiden and how that kind of reappears very frequently in mythology. And one of the things that's very common in Swan Maiden stories is what causes the fairy bride, as she's sometimes known, the mystical bride, to flee. What causes her to flee back to the other world, or in the case of Star Wars, usually die, which is the death is a form of fleeing back to the other world because she's fleeing to the underworld. She's, and a lot of times it does actually happen after she has become a mother. And some scholars theorize that this, when these stories are told from a masculine perspective, it's actually representing anxieties about either women dying in childbirth, because sometimes that happens. Sometimes in these myths, the women, they do die in childbirth. In fact, I think it's a Shinto creation myth in which the goddess gives birth to twins. And then dies, and then the husband pursues her into the underworld. Good one, very interesting, very Anakin and Padme. But a lot of
wait a second, I've heard this before. Yeah,
right, no, exactly. You're like, hang on, this is familiar. Yeah, and so it's either that
he's only tried it like 3 times, like
right. Right, or sometimes it's just other ideas that once the bride, her identity changes to the mother, then she does not, in a sense, belong only to the husband anymore, because now she has transformed into something else. And so that transformation is often represented by her transforming back into maybe her animal form, or again, maybe going to the underworld.
That happens quite often in folklore, where they transform back into an animal form or into an original form. Yeah.
Right. But it's so amazing how frequent it happens after they have, after they have given birth. And so that is something I think that we also see a lot in Star Wars, is that, again, it's as long as these stories are frequently told from a masculine perspective, there's this anxiety over the mother fleeing or the mother leaving.
Right. It's because that aspect of themselves hasn't been fully incorporated into them, because there isn't that perspective in the story. Right. And that POV, right? I did want to briefly touch on Dark Mother stories inside of Star Wars, because it is important to say how these things are framed and what they mean, because traditionally, or at least from an archetypical perspective, the goddess is all, right? So she is the wise old woman who has seen it all and has lived it all, right? And so if this were to ever come out in Star Wars, we would expect it to be that she is a representation of the universe. Like, from a mythical perspective, she would be the creation and universe, but she knows all, right? She is the mom or the warrior, and she is also the maiden, the child, the pre-adolescent, adolescent kid. She is everything, but she is also creation and destruction simultaneously. And dark moms are often both, but like always evil.
Yes.
In Star Wars.
Yes. Very true.
Yes. We got a little bit of like the dark feminine in Rey in her vision, but they really just like made her like a female Palpatine, which was super weird and interesting.
Yeah, they used the visuals, but once again, there was that sense that they didn't really understand what they were tapping into. But
we have 2 examples, because we most recently talked about Mortis. I think we should bring up the EU version of Aboleth, who I'm going to just say I don't like. And I like, quite literally, I've gotten into discussions on Twitter about this, and it's like, I just don't like her. She has no love within her, because it's all twisted, right?
It's very much framed as her maternal instincts are framed as evil, or a path to evil, at least, that, that her desperation to keep her family with her is going to drive her to madness. And, unfortunately, that's how it's framed. And it does tap into quite a lot of patriarchal concepts of hysteria and so on. It's not ideal.
And it's interesting, because she's also like something very powerful within the Star Wars universe. She's the Maw within the Kessel Run, but they've never recanonized the concept of her like avatar or her personhood. And I'm really happy that they haven't. I really hope they never go down that perspective, because dark moms are dark for the sake of protecting their brood. It comes from a different place, protecting their people, protecting what is right. Like Kali destroys like people that are bad and demons. Right. It's protection of the life and the things that need to be protected, because she has spent so much time creating.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a different feeling. There is no creation within Aboleth. It is just, it ends up coming off as just kind of selfish and possessive. It's weird.
Well, and she's the mother figure, but I don't think she actually is the mother of the son and daughter in the story.
She's like a stepmom.
Yeah, so she even
framed
comes
weird.
in.
Even that, like, it doesn't give us anything to chew on from a symbolic perspective. Which
right, she's never
can
truly
be great.
Right, and that's the thing, is she's never truly part of that family, and so they do really, unfortunately, make her into the evil stepmother.
Yeah,
and and then I believe Luke spends a lot of time trying to defeat her, and
yeah. And they've never recanonized her, and I'm kind of happy they haven't.
No, I don't want her back.
Like,
but I think it's interesting, right? Because the mother is missing from the Mortis in the new canon.
Yeah.
But the only mother that existed in the Legends canon is this dark mother who is really not what we want at all. So and doesn't have that power of creation, I think, that we're looking for.
Yeah. Or at least like to create new things, to solve problems, to love and nurture things to a new transcendent resolution. That's what's missing, right?
Right.
What are we fighting for? I almost broke out into song from Mulan.
I was wondering.
Yeah. What is also important is our mother POV. And we have talked a little bit about Hera, but the most dramatic mother POV we had was Mandalorian season 2 with our frog mom.
Yep.
Let's talk about her.
Oh, wow. I struggle with frog mom just because, unfortunately, I think it's very difficult to separate her from her context, from the metatextual conversation, because it's every one of these stories is a conversation with the audience.
Yep.
And that conversation became uncomfortable very quickly, because early on, after being introduced to Frog Mom, we are asked to sympathize with her, to identify with her, to care about the things she cares about.
She actually makes a plea to the audience and to Din, right?
Mm-hmm.
Protect me. Protect this. This is my last chance.
Yes. She's desperate, and that we're meant to take that seriously, that she's desperate, and this is important. And that, again, that Din's care of her is what will allow the creation to occur and the creation to continue.
What are we fighting against the spider monsters for? Right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we got it.
Right. What are we doing this for? Why are we doing this?
Yes.
Right.
Because we have to save her family, because she asked us to.
Din is doing it because he needs somebody to, like, hey, here's a fair, right? Like, it's just a job, ma'am.
Yep.
Originally. But we get that emotional plea to say, this is my last opportunity and this is my last chance. And so many people were utterly hurt by the story, treating it with this like massive joke.
Yeah.
I still argue that they just had to have avoided the last egg eat.
Yeah.
And it would have worked as a story.
Yep. Yeah. It was there
was no learning from perspective of Din to say, hey, bad baby Yoda, like these are precious. This is the creation, container.
Yeah. And it's so strange too, because Grogu's always going around in his own little egg. So it's just so strange that Din would have that example of, his own child in an egg here, and then not, after all, going through all this, have that same care for the children in the eggs, and I know we don't want to go into the whole fertilization thing. Yes, we know. But the point is to not have that same care was so strange.
Yeah. It's about potential, right? Like she could have, if she had died in the cave, if Din had delivered the container, I think people would have still gotten okay with it. It's just, it's complicated. And then there was this whole online churn and a misunderstanding of where people were coming from. And then it was played off as insignificant and a joke. And that really sucks because being able to be online and have discussions with people that you don't know is the reason I have a podcast and the reason I'm able to talk to you, Missy. But it also sucks that people have these online conversations. And I replied to Phil Shostak when he posted his thing, hey, we didn't mean it like that. And we're it doesn't matter if you meant it like that. Death of the author, from a Roland Barthes perspective, is that people are allowed to interpret it from a societal perspective, and objectively any birthing parent who was invested in having kids, or even a non-birthing parent partner who was invested in having kid, would have seen it the exact same way.
Yep. Yes, absolutely.
And there wasn't enough moms in the room or birthing people in the room to comment.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's just so very obvious how limited their perspective is that this did not come up. And then I think, to your point, unfortunately, once it was raised, there was no respect for that concept of impact versus intent, which is that it doesn't matter if you didn't mean it, if you didn't intend it to be this way.
Yeah.
The impact it's extremely painful and it's valid. I
do think that they heard it. I do think that they heard it. I just don't know that some people react in very negative ways to criticism. And it's really fascinating. I mean, Pablo has kind of always been the way he has been with any sort of criticism to do with the franchise, whether it's considered to be valid or it's considered to come from a place like the fandom menace.
Yeah.
He's always been very sarcastic and reactionary.
Yeah.
And I don't know what to say. That's his own personality. I don't really care to comment on it, but it does sort of poison the experience of enjoying a season like that. And then, this leads us into, okay, how does Star Wars treat these characteristics now? And they play into something I've called the male nurturing fantasy.
Yep.
Where dad is dad and mom.
Yes.
Solo dad parent who is exploring the nurturing aspects of his own self, minus a femme identifying person involved in his exploration of this self. And so we got it heavily in The Mandalorian, of course, right? I did an article on it for my own site, which of course you're welcome to read. And I do think that there is a purpose behind what is happening, but it's fascinating that as he becomes the warrior king of the Mandalorians, i.e. he has to take up the mantle of the Mandalorians because he has won the Darksaber, he loses the thing that he is nurturing. Right.
Well, and what's so interesting about that is that, to go back to Campbell seeing the experience of childbirth as one of the transformative moments that a mother figure might experience. Not the only one, but it was something he focused on a lot. What's so interesting about that is that even though, Din has been, nurturing Grogu throughout the story, it's also been sort of a gestation period.
Yeah. Yeah, because he's been
really,
in an egg and
right. And he's been carrying him with him and everything.
Yeah.
And then in the end, he has to sort of give him away, or he has to release him out into a dangerous world. And I'm only going to speak for myself here, but I have heard this echoed by other people. But there was a period during my pregnancies where, you know, with the world appearing to fall apart around me, I was thinking, oh, if only I could just keep them inside where they're safe.
Mm-hmm.
And you know that that's not possible. And that occurs over and over as children age, is that they move more and more into the world, and it becomes less and less possible to protect them. You have to let them go out. And so what's so interesting is, you know, as much as I don't like the way it happened at the end of season 2 for The Mandalorian, it is so interesting how, you know, letting Grogu go does parallel a birth experience in some ways. I didn't experience that.
Yeah. And separations are really fundamental for character growth and defining who you are separate from the person. And then when you come back together, you sort of like renegotiate that relationship together. And I fully suspect that Grogu will be more advanced. And I don't think that they're going to keep him apart from the Mandalorian. I think it's a fundamental part of his story. And to have this nurturing and to re-engage in that relationship I hope we get to see an adolescent Grogu. I think that would be really fascinating, where he can actually talk.
That would be interesting. But it's also interesting that in Star Wars, typically the separations occur from the perspective of the child. And so it's very interesting to see. I'm curious to see. But
we did sort of see that in the end, where Grogu's like looking over Luke's shoulder and like holding out his little hands.
Right. Like, but what will it be if most of the story does focus on Din going forward? Then suddenly we'll be looking at a separation from the perspective of a parent. And I'm very curious to see what happens to that, especially since, as you said, there's very clearly, an unconscious feminine occurring there.
Yeah.
So what will happen?
I don't know. I do also appreciate that the Bad Batch has these nurturing models within it, and that Omega is getting nurtured in the story, and that it is exploring that. It's just like it's frustrating to me that it's like not a mom represented on screen.
Yeah, right.
As part of this, and it could have been, but the Bad Batch are all dudes, all played by Deep Bradley Baker. Like, what are you gonna do? You know,
I'm delighted there are so many great dads in Star Wars. I'm just hoping that mothers get their turn.
It is a struggle, but I think what is fascinating and sort of like the outcome of this whole conversation is that she's there. They're just ignoring her.
Yeah.
These feminine aspects are there throughout the story, and they come out in the character representation and the story that they're telling. But it's like they're trying to constantly stamp her down.
Yeah.
Good old Dan Brown, worst person you can think of, made a really great point. And that's what Star Wars is. And to me, the only way forward, truthfully, the only way forward is for them to fix this story at some point. It is one of the original sins of Star Wars, i.e. separating Anakin from Shmi, killing all of the moms in A New Hope with blowing up Alderaan, and, killing, basically killing parenthood, right? The only way forward to this is by having that healed in a story.
Yeah. And that's if they're pursuing peace as the ultimate outcome. And I think that's the real question. Are they pursuing peace as the ultimate outcome? Because unfortunately, much like the arms dealers on Canto Bight, Star Wars has a vested interest in having
you blow them up today, we blow them up tomorrow. Right.
It's this eternal conflict. People will point out whenever you say you want peace in Star Wars, people are like, but it's Star Wars. And I'm like, it is, but eternal war that's not really the condition of humanity, right? It's a cycle. We do have wars, but we do have peace, and peacetime is necessary for creation and rebuilding and so on and so forth. This is true of art. This is true of so many things. There are things that occur in peacetime. Peacetime is necessary, and and there are stories to be told. There are stories to be told.
Yeah, and it's just like how after a battle, and I always think about how like a big thing for Canada is Flanders Fields, and it's a very it's a big thing because we view it from a healing aspect. We give out poppies every Remembrance Day, which is in November. It's the day that the Second World War ended, because Flanders Fields was one of the big battles that we participated in. And there's this famous poem about how after all of this destruction, poppies grow out of this basically battlefront where many people died. And, because there is a renewal that happens at the end, right? And if there had been a transcendent moment in Tross where the galaxy had been renewed or healed, or something supremely mystical had happened, and a spontaneous growth of things had right. come back into place, everybody would have been like, it doesn't matter what happens 3,000 years in the past,
right?
1,000,000 years in the past. It doesn't matter what happens in the Old Republic, in the ancient start of the Jedi. It all ends in healing. Yes. And that's psychologically what our brains tell us we need.
Right.
We need it to be okay in the end. And so unless they tell a story that is after Tross that heals things, truthfully heals the galaxy in a loving and nurturing way, which is what we're saying we are missing, then I don't know how they solve this problem. It'll all kind of end up not feeling as mystical and plugging into our subconscious as we need.
Yeah. Yeah. I would like to see a new Alderaan. I would like to see Alderaan return, because Alderaan to me is a symbol of that missing mother.
Right.
Most swan maidens come from a watery world. They are aquatic creatures, many of them. And water is frequently related to fertility and associated with the mother. And that's why, you have Naboo is this watery world, and Ahch-To is this watery world. And Alderaan, which was at the beginning of Star Wars in terms of how we experience the story, was destroyed, presumably with, to your point, mother's on it, right? It is sort of the original death of the mother to me. And because it was utterly destroyed, and then we never saw creation on a level to match that degree of destruction. And I think that if we saw that, it would be, to me, that would signal the return of the goddess.
Yeah. And to me, that would be a really exciting time, because then they could go into more mythical storytelling and this, especially it would open up the story to say these large mythical things that are truly wondrous can happen in the Star Wars universe. Remember, science fantasy. Yeah, most people only see it as the fiction aspect, the science part, i.e. technological terrors, giant space balls that fly throughout the galaxy and destroy planets. But there is also this wondrous aspect to Star Wars that the more they lean away from the nurturing and the love and the consideration and compassion for others, because that's fundamentally what the light side of the Force is compassion and love for others. The more that they lean away from that, the less it feels like a balanced system.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, this was an awesome talk.
Yes. This is so great. Thank you so much for having me. I loved it.
Do you want to let people know where they can find you? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Missy, thank you for joining me on this Power of Myth and Symbolism episode. Where can people find you if they're looking for you online?
So you can find me on Tumblr at All Girls Are Princesses.
Oh,
I know, right? I love the little princess. It's one of my favorites. It's so great. And that's a great speech she gives there, just for the record. But the other that I have is on Twitter is where I'm most active, and it's fangirling only. But just to be clear, it's fangirling, FANGIRLING _ only with a 0 in place of the O.
Oh, I had no idea.
NLY. Yes.
I'll link to you in the liner notes. So
yes,
they don't need to remember the 0 if they forget it.
Understandable.
But no, this is great. I really do want to encourage people to start viewing their stories from a what is the lens that is being told? And is there something that is being forgotten? And in Star Wars, it's become pretty damn obvious when anybody talks about mothers or feminine aspects of stories that it is missing. And sometimes it makes people uncomfortable because they're just not used to looking at those aspects in themselves.
Yeah.
All right.
True.
Take care. Bye.
All right. Bye.
Thank you for listening to What the Force. I'm Marie-Claire Gould, your host. Our music is orchestral music by Christy Carew for What the Force. We have a Patreon at patreon.com/whattheforce. We like to thank all our patrons, especially those who love and are obsessed with What the Force: Brad, Melody, Night Huntress in Wild Space, Felicia, How Rude, Anna Perez, Macau Mom, Neil, James, Joe Allen D, Christian Luca, Josh Johnson, Scott C, and Susan. Make sure to like and subscribe on YouTube or leave a 5-star review on iTunes or other pod apps. It helps people find the show. Check out our other channel on YouTube or other podcast feeds, What the Fiction. You can connect with us on Twitter at WT Force Show, What the Force Podcast on Facebook, or our website, whattheforce.ca, or on our Discord. Links are in the liner notes. Feel free to reach out and start a conversation. Cheers.